Okay, so hi, my name is Vincent Collins. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm joining today from Treaty 13 territory in what is colonially known as Toronto. The title of my presentation today is Climate Crisis, a Working Class Future. So thanks, first of all, everyone, for being here. Thanks to the Global Labour Research Centre for hosting this great conference and allowing me the opportunity to speak. Thanks to the other presenter, Victoria, the respondent, Farah, and the moderator, Shruti. I look forward to engaging in what I'm sure will be a very thoughtful discussion after. First of all, I just wanted to start out by saying these are preliminary thoughts that I have as I make my way through the literature for my doctoral dissertation. Therefore, I would truly appreciate feedback. Okay, so my research is centrally based in New York and Toronto, Ontario. So I'm exploring the potential of labour coalitions to be a key site of organising the working class in order to win the transformative climate action necessary for decarbonisation. My interest stems from my life experience of precarious work, continued today as a working class scholar, which I believe situates me well to build relationships with communities that are frequently sceptical of the ivory towers associated with academia. I've just started working as a departmental steward for my Department of Politics in my union QP 3903, which I hope will help bridge the usual divide between research and research participant, as my research participants will also be union workers. I also want to ensure my research is non-extractive, as I see my work as part of a joint struggle, an attempt to improve working class life, and I aim to build this relationship in the same vein as what Leanne Simpson conceptualizes as deep reciprocity, meaning respect, relationship, and responsibility, an alternative to colonial extractivism. During my master's also at York, I completed a major research paper on how the global pandemic exposed the often hidden inequalities experienced by society's most vulnerable. I contended that social movements propelled by a historic global movement on climate and racial justice could seize the political moment for transformational change. My master's research convinced me of the opportunities that arise from broad mobilization to pressure governments to act, and revealed how these mobilizations lacked institutions to support them, which led to my interest in labour organising around the climate crisis. This summer, I attended the inaugural Climate Crisis and the Future of Work summer school at the University of Toronto, in which I was introduced to the labour coalitions I'll discuss today. So now we'll talk about the context of the climate crisis. Climate scientists are clear drastic action to cut greenhouse gas emissions and prevent climate collapse is required this decade. That is a transformation to a decarbonised economy. However, how such change materialises is less clear, with states yet to take meaningful action in curbing emissions, such that emissions rose globally last year. This hesitancy, despite extreme weather events driven by climate change becoming more frequent globally. In 2001, Ontario experienced its worst wildfire season on record. Meanwhile, New York is still recovering from the destruction caused by Hurricane Sandy. We also see states default to a renewable energy sector, what some are calling green capitalism, that is already a haven of low-paid, non-unionised precarious work. Policy experts and scholars have raised concerns that as a broad transition to a decarbonised society becomes increasingly inevitable, that this could happen on the backs of workers and result in precarity and further weaken labour power. We're also seeing a worrying trend where most accounts today of the climate crisis focus on an emergency politics that call for immediate action to overcome the crisis at all costs, even with at times authoritarian tendencies. This research shares the view of critical left thinkers that what is required at this critical juncture is a politics of mass democracy that does not cede the political argument. Rather, the working class can be mobilised around the need to tackle the climate crisis and the potential gains from the need to build a decarbonised economy by securing good paying union jobs for working class people. Okay, so the labour context. The working class, the majority of the population across racial groups and genders who work in every sector of the economy, will be an important site for climate action. As key vehicles for organising the working class, unions are vital to realising action on climate change. What is more, organised labour is experiencing a renewed buoyancy as unions have made gains in areas of the workforce long thought to be out of reach. Despite renewed buoyancy amongst labour, with Amazon and Starbucks being some of the highest profile companies where workers have had successful union drives, the challenge of organised labour remains. The stakes could not be higher. Only a broad-based mobilisation pressurising states to deliver a just and decarbonised world can secure action on climate change. My research will explore the lessons that can be learned from Climate Jobs New York and whether it can be emulated, with the hope that it could be an important tool for mobilising the working class and building labour power. My dissertation seeks to go beyond current literature to add to our understanding of the social variables critical for an energy transition, specifically labour. I'll draw on two labour coalitions, Climate Jobs New York and the Good Jobs for All coalition out of Toronto, Ontario, to understand why Climate Jobs New York has produced significant victories, but the Good Jobs for All coalition has not yet. Climate Jobs New York, a labour coalition born out of the devastation of Hurricane Sandy, bringing home the proximity of climate change and the tepid response of the government in tackling the climate crisis, is a hopeful site for this inquiry. The Good Jobs for All coalition is a labour coalition created in Toronto, Ontario in 2008, with the objective of bringing different community and labour organisations around the idea of guaranteeing good paying jobs in the decarbonised sector. I certainly don't want to attack the Good Jobs for All coalition in my research. It's clear they have done some great organising, but rather, despite the initial promise, the coalition has stalled, particularly with the pandemic. And I want to analyse what could potentially be learned from Climate Jobs New York and the organising that has brought them such success. Let me just touch on what that success looks like. Climate Jobs New York organised across a labour-only coalition, realising that all the new so-called green jobs that were coming were non-union precarious jobs. And so they had to work out how to turn green jobs into good union climate jobs. Their coalition consisted of building trades, energy, transit, public sector, and service sector, strategically organising the most important sectors needed for building this decarbonised economy. They also chose to pressure the state government because it was realised the federal government was not an option at the time, with Donald Trump being president. And New York unions for the US are some of the strongest. It was thought that if organised, they could push then Governor Andrew Cuomo, who was under pressure from a progressive primary candidate, Cynthia Nixon. Cuomo was forced to make concessions on offshore wind, and once elected, he was held to these promises, and Climate Jobs New York was able to win guarantees of prevailing wages for this infrastructure. The state also agreed to have project labour agreements for the turbine work. So they've had major victories and are still organising around demands to ensure a pro-worker decarbonised sector. Climate Jobs New York has also snowballed now to 5 other contexts across the US, where significant wins have occurred on pro-worker climate action in contexts such as Illinois. Okay, so methods, again, these are just some initial thoughts as I build my methodological apparatus. The Marxian workers' inquiry approach conceptualizes that only the working class can provide meaningful information on its own existence, just as only the working class itself can build a new world. This approach will help to understand how workers interact with organising around the climate crisis and the governance of labour coalitions. As it stands, I'll conduct an empirical examination across 2 major sites of the political economy of labour union coalitions, analysing comparatively the Labour Coalition Climate Jobs New York and the Good Jobs for All coalition. I'll undertake a series of semi-structured qualitative interviews across each jurisdiction of workers active in labour union coalitions, as well as members of the respective communities, with the objective of providing representation of working class people. In addition, discourse analysis of key documents such as policy manuals, emails, website communications, and other grey literature that labour unions and coalitions have published will offer insight into how labour and the broader working class is engaging and organising around the climate crisis. Through a comparative study laid out, I'll explore the impact of strong labour-powered climate action on working class people and their broader communities by addressing the following questions. Are labour coalitions such as Climate Jobs New York potential catalysts for rebuilding working class power? What political impact can coalitions have in moving the needle on climate action? I seek to understand the emerging set of practices that have built labour power in the case of New York and explore comparatively with Toronto to gauge why such efforts are stalling. What are the implications of the success of Climate Jobs New York for just planetary futures? What can be learned from this comparison for the Good Jobs for All coalition? Critically, no scholarly research has been conducted on the emergence of Climate Jobs New York and its success in 6 other regions across the US and its potential for replication. And what important work has been done, though, to theorise the role of the working class in the context of the climate crisis without an example of organising that has won just climate action. The findings, I hope, will uplift the voices of workers and reveal how they are engaging with the climate crisis and the role they are playing in a broader mobilisation to secure climate action. Finally, by engaging comparatively with 2 different contexts, I want to uncover why in one context a pioneering labour coalition is emerging and not in another, with the intention of producing recommendations with implications for workers, labour organisers and scholars. So just to sum up, broad-based mobilisation of the people and communities impacted by physical and economic dislocations of climate change is urgently needed to pressure states to take decisive action to deliver a just and decarbonised world. Climate justice literature to date has not attended to labour union coalitions. However, as a key site of organising the working class, such coalitions offer hope of winning transformative climate action necessary for decarbonising our economy. And thanks for listening to me, and happy to take questions, and that's my details. Thanks.
Can you guys see my PowerPoint? Perfect. So today I'm presenting part of my research from my master's thesis, which was entitled Representing Labor, Mass Media's Portrayal of Amazon Warehouse Workers During COVID-19. I'll be discussing part of my findings, which focuses on the overall trajectory of the coverage of Amazon warehouse workers from before the pandemic to the end of the time period in which I covered. The purpose of my thesis was to interrogate whether the re-inclusion of labor in American newspapers of record, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, as well as the Wall Street Journal, during the COVID period represented a hegemonic shift in reporting. With the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, workers from across a myriad of industries conducted and staged a variety of labor actions, including but not limited to walkouts, strikes, and sit-ins, to protest their employers' flippant disregard towards implementing additional health and safety measures required to keep the COVID-19 virus at bay. Essential workers continued speaking out about the hazardous working conditions they're forced to endure, which eventually attracted the attention of these newspapers of record. With this heightened coverage of labor unrest and issues concerning labor during the COVID period, it seemed possible that a shift away from the dominant neoliberal consensus, which had come to define and orient news coverage over the last 40 years, was occurring. Briefly, through the ascension of neoliberalism, coverage of workers in the labor movement plummeted significantly in the United States, as the news industry underwent economic restructuring, while the labor movement concurrently and continuously faced a barrage of assaults by the American state and corporations. Consequently, anti-labor trends in news coverage were amplified, with workers and issues pertaining to labor either being disregarded or further marginalized in the news. This re-inclusion of issues concerning labor appeared as a turning point in news coverage. In order to assess whether or not a hegemonic shift was occurring due to this re-inclusion of labor, I analyzed articles published between August 2019 until November 2020, focusing specifically on the coverage of Amazon warehouse workers. A total of 143 articles, including news articles and opinion pieces, were culled and archived for this research. The following research questions shaped my analysis. How were Amazon warehouse workers framed by the media during COVID-19? How were Amazon warehouse workers framed by the media prior to COVID-19? What were the similarities and/or differences? How does the current news coverage of Amazon warehouse workers fit within historical representations of labor? And what does this coverage suggest in terms of how labor is valued and understood today? For this presentation, I'll be primarily addressing the second question. How are Amazon warehouse workers framed by the media prior to COVID-19? What were the similarities and/or differences? Surprisingly, the pre-COVID coverage of Amazon warehouse workers by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal was overall remarkably more critical and comprehensive than the reporting done by those same outlets throughout COVID-19. Now, it is important to keep in mind that this thesis only examines 7 months worth of pre-COVID coverage, meaning the short time frame of coverage examined may not speak to the overall reporting produced by these news outlets over the last several years. Considering several scholars and journalists have written about the erosion of the quality of the news, specifically the decline in reporting about labor throughout the neoliberal period, the odds are fairly high that the few articles examined prior to COVID-19 sit outside of these news outlets' regular reporting. Further, only 19 articles were published during the 7-month period, suggesting that Amazon remained a relatively underreported topic for these newspapers of record. The differences between the reporting done prior to the COVID-19 pandemic with the coverage published throughout COVID-19, however, are striking and suggest that a narrowing of coverage occurred throughout the COVID period. While the number of articles published about Amazon warehouse workers increased, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal seem to have forgotten or actively disremembered their earlier coverage. Although Amazon workers engaged in labor actions prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the labor unrest at Amazon warehouses throughout the pandemic was presented as disconnected from these earlier struggles, which remarkably these very news outlets had reported on shortly before the pandemic occurred. As such, it appeared as if the media was dynamically participating in the rewriting of the history of the conflict between Amazon and Amazon workers throughout their pandemic reporting. Independent writer and scholar Laura Basu, in her book Media Amnesia, Rewriting Economic Crisis, identifies the tendency of the dominant media to actively forget their recent coverage as a form of media amnesia. Media amnesia, according to Basu, speaks to the moments in which crisis, phenomena, or events are reframed, where certain information is forgotten and other information is added, so that the crisis narrative is fluid, malleable, and difficult to grasp in its entirety, creating what Basu refers to as a neoliberal Groundhog Day. Rather than perceiving media amnesia as an accidental phenomenon, Basu argues that media amnesia works to legitimize policies and actors who are responsible for the original crisis in question. Through the media actively disremembering their own reporting, the solutions they proposed and discussed regarding the global financial crisis, which was brought on by neoliberalist policies, was the intensification and expansion of neoliberalism. Media amnesia plays an integral role in both limiting the discussions of what solutions to a given crisis are possible, as well as primes the public to accept the further entrenchment of the very economic policies producing the crisis to begin with. Through the reframing of events, the causes of the problem are lost or reconfigured to suit the solutions advanced by media outlets, government officials, as well as corporate representatives. There are 3 fundamental features within media coverage that produces and contributes to the production of media amnesia: an absence of historical contextualization, a limited range of perspectives privileging elite views, as well as a failure to connect local or national issues within a global context. While all 3 characteristics were present throughout the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal's coverage of Amazon warehouse workers, an absence of historical contextualization, alongside the privileging of elite views, significantly shaped the stories, frames, and narratives produced. Although several examples of media amnesia were found throughout the period covered in my thesis, There is one example in particular that captures the impact of media amnesia in the framing of Amazon warehouse workers' labor unrest, from pre-pandemic to pandemic reporting. 2 warehouse visits were reported on by the Washington Post and the New York Times between August 2019 and November 2020. One occurred on August 25th, 2019, and was reported on by Jay Green from the Washington Post. The other, almost a year apart, was reported on June 9th, 2020 by Karen Weiss of the New York Times. On August 25th, 2019, Jay Green published a story at the Washington Post titled, "Amazon's Strategy to Win Over Lawmakers, Lawmaker Critics, Warehouse Tours." In this article, Green illustrates the public relations theater of Amazon strategically inviting people in powerful positions, including lawmakers, to observe and view their warehouses. The tours were broached with skepticism, with Green attempting to see through the facade calculatedly constructed by Amazon. In the article, Green writes, quote, "From the White House to the campaign trail for the Democratic presidential nomination, politicians have found a popular punching bag in Amazon, accusing the retail giant of paying subsistence wages to warehouse workers while dodging taxes. For years, critics have accused the company of underpaying and overworking warehouse employees. In the United States, Amazon employs about 250,000 typically hourly workers, many of whom perform strenuous and mundane jobs, such as walking many miles a day, picking items off shelves, or packing up boxes. In response, the online retail giant has started a campaign to try to turn the tide, particularly as regulators take a closer look at the company for possible abuse of power. Amazon has increased efforts to push back against its critics, including offering tours at 23 warehouses in the United States to let visitors see firsthand how its facilities operate. The company said more than 150,000 people have toured this year, including more than 560 federal, state, and local policymakers and their staffs, a pace that is likely to far surpass the number of visits it had last year. And with Congress now on its summer break, the company has welcomed a bevy of politicians to warehouses nationwide in recent weeks. The spate of warehouse visits hasn't toned down any of the opprobrium from Amazon's fiercest critics. Senator Bernie Sanders has said he would visit an Amazon fulfillment center, but in his ongoing sparring with the company, he has said he's not interested in a photo op at an Amazon warehouse, end quote. Despite Green's attempts to minimize the criticisms made against Amazon by using language such as critics using Amazon as a punching bag, or by suggesting that claims made against Amazon are merely accusations, the article clearly indicates that Amazon is using warehouse tours as a tool in their public relations strategy to offset the building criticisms that were becoming commonplace. Green conveys the scale at which Amazon has opened up their facilities in an attempt to manufacture moments of transparency between the American public and the corporation. Yet Green also identifies the ineffectiveness of the warehouse tours while reiterating the truth behind them, creating potential photo opportunities as a way to dissuade lawmakers and other people in power that Amazon is in fact exploiting their workforce. This skepticism and critique entirely vanish about a year later. On June 9th, 2020, Karen Weiss and Ruth Fremson published a story in the New York Times titled, "What It Looks Like Inside an Amazon Warehouse Now," after they partook in an Amazon warehouse tour. With Amazon warehouse workers widely publicizing Amazon's ineffective and delayed responses to implementing COVID-19 health and safety measures for several months, Amazon decided to open their warehouses once more to the public. The purpose of these warehouse tours was to illustrate that the critiques waged against Amazon by Amazon workers and the media were unfounded. As warehouse worker organizer and activist William Stoltz remarks, quote, "Since our protest, Amazon started propaganda tours of sorts. Anyone can visit," end quote. However, the propagandistic nature of the warehouse visits went unnoticed by Weiss and Fremson. In their article, they write, quote, "The giant internet retailer has started running television ads that show that its warehouses and delivery employees have masks and other protective gear. It has pushed out segments to local news stations touting its safety improvements. It has asked journalists to visit its warehouses to see for themselves. But in recent weeks, workers said, some conditions inside the warehouses have improved, and the company, which was in emergency response mode in March and April, has resumed a more regular rhythm of business," end quote. Although Weiss and Fremson begin their article expounding on the public relations campaign Amazon has embarked on to deter people from believing their warehouses pose a health and safety risk to warehouse workers, They dilute this connection by highlighting how the warehouses have changed. Considering Amazon opened up one of their most technologically sophisticated warehouses for these warehouse tours, Weiss and Fremsen's skepticism should be foregrounded throughout the article. Instead, Weiss and Fremsen document the changes they noticed, or perhaps the changes pointed out to them by the Amazon representative guiding their tour in the warehouses, including the heightened surveillance techniques employed by Amazon, such as thermal cameras used to constantly monitor warehouse workers' temperature, as well as the testing center Amazon constructed. Weiss and Fremsen write, quote, "The biggest transformation is at the building's warehouse entryway, a wide lobby area with tall turnstiles. Workers would previously pass through the turnstiles and start their shift. Now, when they arrive, they're channeled past thermal cameras manned by colleagues to take their temperatures. When workers enter the makeshift testing center, they scan their company badge. They're handed via forceps a test kit for the virus. Workers still come and go. They grab lunch in the break room and have a smoke outside. Those are signs that business is getting back to normal." Emily Deschamps, a worker whom Amazon authorized to talk publicly, joined the warehouse in October. She said the biggest change hadn't been physical, but rather how Amazon had adjusted break times to stagger them and reduce congestion. The company also gave people extra time to wash their hands, she said. Instead of Weiss and Fremsen approaching their warehouse visit with skepticism, the article does precisely what Amazon had hoped their warehouse tours would achieve. Through these warehouse tours, the press would alter their critical narratives regarding the safety of Amazon warehouses. Weiss and Fremsen offer up an image of Amazon as back to business while supporting their employees. Amazon may have deserved criticisms for their slow implementation of COVID-19 related health and safety measures, but things have changed. The warehouses have changed, they have actually improved. Rather than questioning the reasoning behind their visit, or perhaps even attempting to see behind the images of the warehouse put forward by Amazon, Weiss and Fremsen marveled at the changes they found. And yet these changes surprisingly did not deter the spread of COVID-19. In fact, about 6 months after this article was published, the World Socialist website, as well as other media outlets, reported that Pushan Brown, an Amazon worker tasked with doing COVID-19 testing, had died from the COVID-19 virus. While Brown did not work at the warehouse Weiss and Fremsen visited, Brown's passing is further evidence of the ineffectiveness of Amazon's health and safety measures, an ineffectiveness that Weiss and Fremsen failed to consider in the reporting of their warehouse tour. The stark contrast between the reporting of these two warehouse visits clearly indicate the workings of media amnesia. Between the two warehouse visits, a deadly pandemic swept around the globe. Multiple strikes took place at Amazon warehouses around the country. Workers stopped showing up to work despite their insecure financial positions, while Amazon massively grew and expanded their operations. Despite the myriad of opportunities for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal to advance their criticisms of Amazon throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, their coverage suggests that these newspapers of record are less willing to criticize Amazon now than they were before. From this perspective, while a shift away from neoliberalism may be percolating on the ground in the United States, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal seem to have intensified their commitment to upholding neoliberalist values, where these newspapers of record align themselves with corporations such as Amazon, rather than with Amazon's workers. Ultimately, through the process of media amnesia, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times have worked to re-legitimize Amazon's role in the US economy and society. Thank you.